Hello.
Reddit, I never thought I'd be here, but I guess that's what betrayal does, it pushes you into places you never imagined you'd be. My name's Mike, 35, and I've been married to Emily for 6 years. We met in college, fell in love fast, and built a life together that, to everyone else, looked picture perfect. Friends always said we were the couple who had it all: love, trust, the whole package. But lately, things haven't been so perfect. Over the past few months, I started noticing changes in Emily. It was little things. At first she became distant, always on her phone, and started working late a lot. She used to share everything with me, from her work drama to random thoughts about our future, but now she'd just brush me off with a vague answer whenever I asked what was going on. I tried to give her space, assuming it was work stress or just a phase, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more it ate away at me. Her behavior kept getting stranger. She'd laugh at messages she wouldn't show me, take calls in another room, and started dressing up more than usual when she went out. When I brought it up, she'd roll her eyes and tell me I was being paranoid, that she was just tired, or that I needed to stop overthinking. I wanted to believe her. I really did. After all, this was the woman I'd promised to love and trust for the rest of my life. But something didn't sit right. The gut feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away, no matter how much I tried to push it down. I found myself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every little thing she'd said and done over the past few months. Was I imagining it? Was I really just being paranoid, as she said? Or was there something deeper going on, something that I was too afraid to face? I decided I couldn't live like that anymore. I needed answers, and I needed to know if the life we'd built together was real or just a facade. What I didn't realize then was that the truth was far worse than anything I could have imagined. After weeks of sleepless nights and that gnawing feeling in my gut, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was really going on. So, one evening, when Emily was in the shower, I did something I'd never done before. I went through her phone. I felt sick to my stomach as I picked it up, my hands shaking. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who snoops, but I also couldn't keep living in the dark. As soon as I unlocked her phone, my heart sank. There were messages from a guy named Jake. I had never heard her mention him before, which immediately set off alarm bells. The messages weren't explicit, but they were just wrong. Flirty, late-night exchanges, and plans to meet up when she was supposed to be working late. My head started spinning as I scrolled through their conversation, trying to make sense of it all. Then, I saw the message that confirmed everything: "Tonight's going to be amazing. Can't wait to see you." It was sent earlier that day, and I suddenly realized she wasn't going to any work meeting that night. She was going to see him. I felt like my heart had been ripped out of my chest. All the doubts and fears I'd been trying to ignore came crashing down on me at once. Emily, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, was lying to me. She was sneaking around with some guy named Jake, laughing behind my back while I was at home, worrying about why she'd become so distant. I could hear the water still running in the shower. And I knew I had only a few minutes before she'd come out. I quickly put her phone back exactly where I found it and tried to compose myself. My mind was racing. What was I supposed to do now? Confront her? Pretend I didn't know? My emotions were a storm inside me, but I knew one thing: I couldn't let her know I'd found out. Not yet. When Emily came out of the bathroom, she smiled at me like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't planning to meet up with another man that very night. I forced a smile back, pretending everything was fine. But inside, I was shattered. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in bed next to her, listening to her breathe, my mind a chaotic mess of anger, hurt, and disbelief. I kept replaying the messages in my head, trying to figure out how we'd gotten here, how the woman I loved could betray me like this. But I knew I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed more than just a few texts. I needed to know exactly what was going on, how deep her lies went, and how long this had been happening. So, I made a decision. I was going to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. And when I did, I would make sure Emily and Jake regretted every single lie they'd told. The next few days were the hardest I'd ever endured. Every time I looked at Emily, I saw the woman I fell in love with, the woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. But now, there was this shadow, this dark secret that she was keeping from me. I couldn't stand the thought of her lying to my face, smiling like everything was fine while she was planning to meet up with Jake behind my back. I started paying closer attention to her every move. I noticed how she'd always keep her phone face down, how she'd slip out of the room to take calls, and how she'd casually mention working late or meeting up with friends when I knew she was lying. It was like living with a stranger who wore the face of the woman I loved. Then came the night when everything fell into place. Emily told me she had another late meeting and wouldn't be home until late. I pretended to be busy with my own plans, but I knew this was my chance. I followed her, staying far enough behind that she wouldn't notice. My heart pounded in my chest as I trailed her through the city, every stoplight and turn making me more anxious. She didn't go to her office. Instead, she drove to a trendy restaurant on the other side of town. I parked a few spots away and watched as she walked inside. I gave it a few minutes, then decided to follow her in. The place was busy, but I managed to slip in unnoticed, keeping to the shadows as I scanned the room, and there she was, sitting at a table in the corner, laughing with a guy who could only be Jake. I felt my blood run cold as I watched them together, so comfortable, so familiar. She looked happier than I'd seen her in months, her smile wide and genuine in a way that she hadn't smiled around me in a long time. It was like watching a nightmare unfold before my eyes. They were sharing a bottle of wine. Their heads close together as they talked and laughed. At one point, she reached across the table and touched his hand, and he smiled at her like she was the only person in the world. I wanted to storm over there, to demand answers, to tear them both apart. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, my world crumbling around me as I watched the woman I loved with another man. But then, something snapped inside me. I realized that this wasn't just about catching her in the act. I needed to understand how deep this betrayal went. I needed to know exactly what she was willing to risk for this guy, this Jake. So, instead of confronting them, I pulled out my phone and took a few photos. Proof. Something tangible to hold on to when the inevitable confrontation came. I slipped out of the restaurant before they could notice me, my hands shaking as I drove away. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. Emily had been lying to me for who knows how long, playing me for a fool while she was out with him. But now I had proof, and I was going to use it. I wasn't going to confront her yet, no. I needed to let her dig herself deeper. I wanted to see just how far she was willing to go. That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't face her, not after seeing her with Jake, not after realizing how easily she could deceive me. I parked my car in a deserted lot and just sat there for hours, staring at nothing, trying to process everything. My heart was shattered, but in the midst of the pain, something else was growing, a determination to make sure Emily and Jake paid for what they were doing to me. I knew I couldn't let her know I'd been there, that I'd seen them together. Not yet. I had to play it cool, to pretend everything was normal, so I could keep gathering information. This wasn't just about catching her, it was about making her realize the gravity of her betrayal. I wanted her to feel the same hurt, the same shock that I'd felt when I saw her with him. I wanted her to know that I wasn't the fool she thought I was, and so, I went home, forcing myself to act like nothing had happened. Emily was already in bed, pretending to be exhausted from her meeting. I slipped into bed beside her, my heart pounding with anger and grief, knowing that the real confrontation was still to come. I was going to make sure that when it did, it would be something she'd never forget. The days that followed were a brutal test of patience. Every moment I spent with Emily felt like a lie, her every word a painful reminder of what I'd seen. But I knew I had to keep playing my part. The confrontation would come, but only when I had everything lined up, when there would be no escape for her. Then, one evening, she made the mistake I had been waiting for. Emily told me she had another late meeting, but this time, I didn't need to follow her. I already knew where she was going and who she'd be with. Instead, I stayed home, pretending to be absorbed in some mundane task while she got ready. When she finally left, I gave her a few minutes to get clear, then grabbed my keys and headed out. I wasn't planning to follow her this time. I was going to the one place she never expected me to go, our own home. There's a spot behind our house where the back door has a slight flaw, a place where I could slip in unnoticed. I knew if I could get in and stay quiet, I could find out just how far this betrayal went. I could hear what they really thought of me, hear it straight from her mouth. When I got back, the house was dark, just as I'd expected. I parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, careful not to make any noise. I slipped through the back door, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way through the kitchen and toward the living room. And there they were. I froze as I heard them, Emily and Jake, just a few feet away in the next room. They were sitting close, talking in low voices, completely unaware that I was there, listening to every word. At first, it was just idle chatter, the kind of nonsense you'd expect from two people who thought they were safe, but then the conversation shifted. "I still can't believe he hasn't figured it out," Jake said with a chuckle. "You sure he's not suspicious?" Emily sighed. "I don't know. He's been acting strange lately, but I think he's just stressed. He keeps asking me about work, about my meetings. I've had to come up with new excuses almost every day." Jake laughed, a cruel sound that made my blood boil. "He must be an idiot. No offense, but how could he not notice? You've been with me more than you've been with him lately." I clenched my fists, the anger rising in me like a tidal wave. But I forced myself to stay silent, to keep listening. "Yeah, well, he's always been trusting," Emily replied, her tone dismissive. "Too trusting, really. I just have to keep up the act a little longer. It's almost funny, how easy it is to fool him." I felt like I was going to explode. The woman I loved, the one I'd trusted with everything, was sitting there laughing about how stupid she thought I was. But then, the conversation took a turn that sent chills down my spine. "I can't wait until we don't have to hide anymore," Jake said, his voice lowering. "Once you leave him, we can finally be together, for real." Emily was quiet for a moment, then she sighed again. "Yeah. It's just, he's not a bad guy, you know. He doesn't deserve this. But I can't keep pretending. I'm just not in love with him anymore." Hearing those words was like a knife to the heart. I had known she was cheating, but hearing her say she didn't love me anymore, that she was planning to leave, was a different kind of pain. It was a death sentence for the life we'd built together. They kept talking, making plans for their future together, completely oblivious to the fact that I was right there, listening to every word. They laughed and joked, sharing little details of their affair, as if I were some distant memory, a problem they'd soon be rid of. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I slipped back out the way I came, my mind spinning. I felt sick to my stomach, but I knew I couldn't confront them yet. Not like this. I needed more, something that would make sure they both felt the full weight of their betrayal. I needed a plan, something that would hit them where it hurt. As I walked away from the house, the cool night air did little to calm the fire burning inside me. They thought they were so clever, so untouchable, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't going to let them walk away from this unscathed. I was going to make sure they regretted every laugh, every lie, every secret they had shared at my expense. This wasn't just about catching them anymore. It was about making them pay. And I knew exactly how to start. After that night, something in me shifted. The shock and pain were still there, but they were starting to give way to something colder, more calculated. I realized I had been playing by their rules, reacting to their moves. That needed to change. If they thought they could keep me in the dark, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. The first step of my plan was simple. I needed to create doubt and fear. I needed to rattle them, to make them start questioning everything. And I knew exactly how to do it, The next day, I went to work as usual, keeping up appearances, but my mind was elsewhere. When I got home, I pretended everything was normal, acting as if I hadn't heard them conspiring the night before. Emily seemed a bit tense, but I couldn't tell if it was because of her guilt or because she was planning to meet Jake again. Either way, it didn't matter. She had no idea what was coming. That evening, I waited until she was in the shower, her usual routine before she'd head out for one of her meetings. I walked quietly to the garage, where the main power panel was located. I flipped a few switches, cutting the power to the entire house. Suddenly, the place was plunged into darkness. I heard Emily shout from the bathroom. "Mike? What happened to the lights?" I didn't answer. Instead, I waited in the dark, listening as she fumbled around, trying to figure out what was going on. I knew she'd be panicking. Emily was never good with the dark, and with her plans with Jake, this would completely throw her off balance. After a few minutes, I heard her come out of the bathroom, still calling my name. I stayed silent, watching as she stumbled around, trying to find her phone. When she finally did, she turned on the flashlight and made her way to the living room, calling out for me again. I could see the fear and confusion on her face, and it gave me a sick sense of satisfaction. I waited until she was close to the window before I made my next move. I knocked softly on the glass, just loud enough for her to hear. She froze, the light from her phone shaking as she turned towards the window. "Mike? Is that you?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't respond. Instead, I knocked again, a little louder this time. I could see the panic setting in now. She looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was nothing for her to latch onto. Just darkness and silence. Finally, I stepped out from the shadows, letting her see me standing there in the hallway. Her eyes went wide, and I could see the questions in them, the fear that maybe I knew more than I was letting on. "Power's out," I said casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "Must be a blown fuse or something." She stared at me, trying to gauge if I was lying or if this was just some bizarre coincidence. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out if I had been the one knocking on the window, if I was somehow onto her. "I tried calling you," she stammered, clearly rattled. I shrugged, pretending not to notice her nervousness. "Must have been out of range. I'll go check the breaker." I walked past her, heading back to the garage, but I could feel her eyes on me the whole time. She was on edge now, her mind undoubtedly racing with 1,000 paranoid thoughts. That's exactly what I wanted. I pretended to fiddle with the breaker for a few minutes before flipping the switches back on. The house hummed back to life, the lights flickering on. I walked back inside, finding her still standing in the living room, her face pale. "All fixed," I said, giving her a reassuring smile. "Just a minor glitch," she nodded, but I could see she was still shaken. Whatever plans she had with Jake were now thrown into disarray. I could tell she was debating whether to go through with it or to cancel, worried that something was off. In the end, she stayed home. I could see her trying to act normal, but the damage was done. She was nervous, constantly checking her phone, glancing at me like I was some puzzle she couldn't solve. I pretended not to notice, but inside, I was pleased. This was just the beginning. That night, I went to bed with a sense of grim satisfaction. I had taken the first step in regaining control. Emily thought she could deceive me. Thought she could get away with betraying me, but now the tables were turning. I wasn't going to just confront her, I was going to make her feel the same fear and uncertainty that she had inflicted on me. This was just the first strike. There was more to come, and by the time I was done, Emily and Jake would regret every single lie. The next morning, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Emily was clearly rattled, but she was trying hard to play it off as just another normal day. I could tell she hadn't slept much, her eyes were red and puffy, and she was quieter than usual. I went through the motions of our morning routine, pretending not to notice how jumpy she was, how her eyes flicked to me every few seconds, like she was trying to figure out what I knew. Over breakfast, I casually mentioned the power outage from the night before. Weird how the lights went out, huh? Did it freak you out? She looked up from her coffee, her face a careful mask of calm. Yeah, a little. But I guess it was just a blown fuse or something. Right? Probably, I said, shrugging. But it's strange, though. I don't think we've ever had that happen before, she nodded, but I could see the gears turning in her head. She was trying to figure out if I was hinting at something, if I knew more than I was letting on. But I kept my expression neutral, just making casual conversation, letting her paranoia do the work for me. As the day went on, I kept the pressure on in subtle ways. I'd catch her eye and hold her gaze just a little too long, or I'd make offhand comments that seemed innocent enough but left her wondering if there was a hidden meaning behind them. Every time she tried to relax, I'd do something to remind her that things weren't normal, that something was off. In the evening, I suggested we watch a movie together, something we hadn't done in weeks. She hesitated, clearly wanting to get in touch with Jake, but she agreed. As we sat there on the couch, I could feel the tension radiating off her. She was uncomfortable, unsure of what was coming next. That's exactly what I wanted. Halfway through the movie, I paused it and turned to her. Emily, is everything okay? You've seemed really stressed lately. She stiffened, her eyes wide as she tried to read my expression. I'm fine, just work stuff, you know. It's been a lot. I nodded slowly, keeping my tone light. If there's anything bothering you, you can tell me. I just want to make sure you're okay. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm okay, really. Just tired. I didn't push further. I wanted her to think she was still in control, that she could keep hiding whatever it was she thought she was hiding. But I could see the cracks starting to form. She was second-guessing herself, questioning every word I said, wondering if I was onto her. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, I made one final move. As I climbed into bed, I casually mentioned, you know, I've been thinking we should take a weekend trip together. Just the two of us, to get away from everything. Emily's face went pale, and I could see the panic flash in her eyes. She stammered, trying to find an excuse. I don't know, Mike. Work is really busy right now. Maybe later, I smiled, pretending not to notice her distress. Come on, Em. We need this. It's been a while since we've had some time just for us. Don't you think it would be good? She bit her lip, clearly torn. I could tell she was trying to think of a way out, but she was trapped. Finally, she nodded. Yeah, maybe you're right. Let's talk about it this weekend. I could see how much it cost her to say that, how scared she was of being alone with me, away from Jake, away from her safety net. But she couldn't refuse without raising even more suspicion. I had her right where I wanted her. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the sound of her breathing next to me, I knew the weekend trip would be the perfect opportunity to confront her. Away from the distractions, away from any chance of escape. It would be just the two of us, and she would have no choice but to face the consequences of her actions, but I wasn't going to rush it. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and I could see them growing in her mind, twisting her thoughts, making her paranoid. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her guilt, to squirm under the pressure of not knowing what I knew or when I might confront her. The trip would be the climax, the moment when everything came crashing down. But until then, I would keep her on edge, keep her guessing, until she couldn't take it anymore. By the time we got to that cabin, Emily wouldn't just be scared, she'd be terrified. And that was exactly what I wanted. The weekend trip was officially on. Emily had no choice but to go along with it, though I could see the anxiety etched into every line of her face. She tried to hide it, of course, playing the part of the dutiful wife who was just tired from work. But every time she looked at me, I could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as clueless as she hoped. I booked a remote cabin a few hours away, deep in the woods. The kind of place where the cell service was spotty, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Perfect for a romantic getaway, or a confrontation with no escape. I made a show of how excited I was, talking about the fresh air, the peace and quiet. How it would be good for us to reconnect. Emily nodded along, forcing smiles, but I could tell she was dreading every minute of it. When the day finally came, I loaded up the car, making sure everything was ready. Emily packed lightly, too lightly for a weekend trip, but I didn't say anything. She was clearly thinking about how quickly she could get out of there if things went south. Little did she know, that was exactly what I was counting on. The drive to the cabin was tense, the silence between us almost suffocating. I tried to make small talk, but Emily's responses were clipped, distracted. She kept looking out the window, her mind clearly elsewhere. I knew she was probably running through all the possible scenarios in her head, trying to prepare for what might happen. But she didn't know the half of it. As we got closer to the cabin, the roads became narrower, the trees denser. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. I could feel Emily's unease growing with every mile. She was gripping the door handle a little too tightly, her breathing a little too shallow. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, it was nearly dark. The place was perfect, isolated, quiet, with nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees. I could see Emily's eyes darting around, taking in the surroundings, trying to figure out how far she was from the nearest sign of civilization. But she smiled at me, that strained, forced smile that told me everything I needed to know. "This place is nice," she said, her voice wavering just a bit, "isn't it?" I replied, pretending to be oblivious to her discomfort. "Just what we need to relax and unwind." We unpacked the car in silence, and I could feel the tension between us growing thicker by the minute. Inside the cabin, I lit a fire, trying to create a cozy atmosphere, but the warmth of the flames did nothing to thaw the coldness between us. We sat down to dinner, a simple meal I had thrown together, but neither of us had much of an appetite. After dinner, we moved to the living room, sitting in front of the fire. The silence was deafening. I could see Emily struggling to find something to say, to break the tension, but nothing came. Finally, I decided to make my move. "Emily," I said, my voice low, breaking the silence. "There's something I need to talk to you about." She looked up at me, her eyes wide, fear flashing across her face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, letting the silence hang between us for a moment longer. Then, I leaned forward, fixing her with a steady gaze. "I know," the color drained from her face in an instant. "Know what?" she stammered, trying to play dumb, but the panic in her eyes betrayed her. "About Jake," I said, my voice calm, almost too calm. "I know everything, Emily. The texts, the phone calls, the meetings, all of it." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to come up with some kind of response. "Mike, She began, but I cut her off. "Don't bother lying," I said, my tone hardening. "I've seen the messages, Emily. I've followed you. I watched you with him." Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't moved. "It's not what you think," she tried to say, but I could hear the desperation in her voice. "It's exactly what I think," I replied coldly. "You've been lying to me for months. Laughing at me behind my back. Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" She started to cry, real tears this time, but I felt nothing. "Mike, I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I never meant for this to happen. I was just so unhappy, and I didn't know what to do." I stared at her, letting her words hang in the air. "Unhappy?" I repeated, my voice dripping with bitterness. "So, you decided to cheat on me? To sneak around with some guy while I was sitting at home, wondering why my wife was suddenly a stranger?" She reached out to me, but I pulled back, refusing to let her touch me. "Please, Mike," she begged. "We can fix this. I'll end it with Jake. I'll do anything. Just, please don't leave me." I stood up, towering over her as she sat there, broken and sobbing. "Do you really think it's that simple? I asked, my voice cold. That you can just say you're sorry, and everything will go back to the way it was. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I know I've hurt you, she choked out. But I love you, Mike. I never stopped loving you. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I stepped outside the cabin. Emily's sobs echoed through the walls, but I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone who had lied, cheated, and laughed behind my back. Standing there in the darkness, I felt like I was watching my life burn down around me, but I wasn't sure whether to feel relief or despair. I stood there for a long time, staring out into the dense forest, trying to wrap my mind around everything that had happened. Part of me wanted to go back inside, to demand more answers, to make her explain how she could do this to me. But another part of me was just tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of the pain, tired of trying to hold on to something that had already shattered beyond repair. Eventually, the cold began to seep into my bones, and I knew I couldn't stay out there forever. I turned and walked back to the cabin, bracing myself for whatever awaited me inside. When I opened the door, the fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the room. Emily was still on the couch, her face buried in her hands, her sobs quieter now, more broken. She looked up when she heard me enter, her eyes red and swollen. Mike, please, she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. We can fix this. I'll do anything. I shook my head, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on me. How, Emily? How do you fix something like this? You didn't just cheat, you destroyed my trust. You made a fool out of me. I know, she cried, reaching out for me again, but I pulled back. I was wrong, so wrong. I don't know why I did it. I was confused, lost, but I never wanted to hurt you like this. But you did, I replied, my voice hollow. And now I don't know if there's anything left to save. She broke down again, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I wanted to feel something for her, some trace of the love that had once been there, but all I felt was numb. The anger, the pain, it had all been so overwhelming that now there was nothing left. Just emptiness. Do you love him? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock. No. I don't love him. It was never about love, Mike. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. I was lonely, and he was there, but I never stopped loving you. I nodded, trying to process her words, but they felt hollow. I couldn't tell if she was telling the truth or just saying what she thought I wanted to hear. It didn't matter anymore. Why didn't you just talk to me? I asked, my voice cracking. If you were lonely, if you were unhappy, why didn't you come to me instead of running to him? I don't know, she sobbed, shaking her head. I was scared. I thought if I told you how I was feeling, you'd leave me, or you wouldn't understand. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but it's the truth. I stood there, staring down at her, trying to decide what to do next. The truth was out, and it felt like there was nothing left to say. No more lies. No more excuses. Just the cold, hard reality of what had happened. I'm going to bed, I finally said, my voice flat. I need to think. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, but didn't say anything as I turned and headed for the bedroom. The bed that we had once shared felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it all. The woman I had loved, the life we had built together, it was all gone, crumbled to dust in the span of a single night. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares, images of Emily with Jake, their laughter ringing in my ears, their whispered promises echoing in my mind. I woke up in a cold sweat, the early morning light filtering through the window, and realized that there was no going back. The trust, the love, the life we had shared, it was all over. When I finally got up, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying all night. She looked up at me, hope flickering in her eyes, but I didn't have the heart to give her false hope. "We need to go home," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "There's nothing more to say here." She nodded, her face crumpling as she tried to hold back another wave of tears. I packed up my things in silence, and soon, we were back in the car, driving away from the cabin, from the place where everything had come crashing down. The drive back was just as tense as the drive there, but this time, it was a different kind of tension. Emily knew what was coming, and I was struggling to accept it. By the time we got home, the numbness had worn off, replaced by a deep sadness that settled in my chest like a heavy stone. We unpacked in silence, and I couldn't even bring myself to look at her. Every time I did, all I saw was the betrayal, the lies, and the life that had been torn apart. Finally, I turned to her, the words coming out before I even realized I was speaking. "I need space, Emily. I'm going to stay with Dave for a while." She didn't protest, didn't try to stop me. She just nodded, her face crumpling as the reality of what was happening hit her. "Please, Mike," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't give up on us. I'll do anything you want. Just, don't leave me." I looked at her, my heart breaking all over again, but I knew what I had to do. "I'm not leaving you, Emily. But I can't be here right now. I need time to think, to figure out what I want. I need to be alone." She nodded again, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't say anything as I packed a bag and headed for the door. The weight of what had happened hung heavy between us, but there was nothing more to say. As I drove away, I felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness, anger, relief. The confrontation was over, but the hardest part was still to come. I had to decide what to do next, how to move forward from here. But for now, all I knew was that I needed space, needed to get away from the pain and the memories that haunted every corner of the house I had once called home. Staying with Dave was a strange mix of comfort and discomfort. He was a good friend, someone I could trust, but explaining why I needed to crash at his place wasn't easy. I didn't tell him everything right away, just that Emily and I were having some issues and I needed a little space to clear my head. He didn't push for details, just handed me a beer and told me to take all the time I needed. Those first few days were the hardest. I'd wake up early in the morning, my mind immediately flooded with thoughts of Emily and everything that had happened. I'd replay the confrontation in the cabin over and over, wondering if I could have handled it differently, if there was something I missed. Something that might have changed the outcome. But every time, I came to the same conclusion: there was no going back. What we had was broken beyond repair. Emily tried to reach out a few times, texting and calling, but I ignored most of her attempts. I wasn't ready to talk to her, not after everything that had happened. The pain was still too fresh, too raw. When I did respond, it was short and to the point, mostly about practical matters like bills and the house. I couldn't bring myself to talk about anything deeper. One evening, a few days after I moved in with Dave, she sent me a long text, pouring her heart out. She apologized again, said she was willing to do whatever it took to make things right, to win back my trust. She begged me to give her another chance, to come home so we could work through things together. But as I read her words, all I felt was exhaustion. I couldn't go back to that house, back to her, and pretend everything was okay. Too much had been broken. I spent my days trying to distract myself, going to work, hitting the gym, hanging out with Dave. But no matter what I did, the thoughts of Emily and Jake crept in. The nights were the worst, lying awake in the dark, the silence amplifying every fear. Every doubt. I'd toss and turn, wondering what I should do, how I could ever move on from this. Then one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through the old photos and messages Emily and I had shared over the years. The happy moments, the vacations, the silly little inside jokes. It all felt like someone else's life, like a dream that I had woken up from, only to find myself in a nightmare. I found myself rereading the messages between Emily and Jake that I had discovered. The ones where they laughed at me, made plans behind my back, and shared things that should have been ours alone. The anger started bubbling up again, a reminder that I couldn't just sweep this under the rug and pretend it didn't happen, but mixed in with the anger was a deep, aching sadness. I had loved Emily, truly loved her, and I thought she loved me too. I couldn't understand how it had all gone so wrong. Was it something I did? Something I didn't do? Was it really just about her being lonely, or was there more to it? The questions swirled in my mind, driving me crazy because I knew there were no answers that would make any of this better. A few days later, I decided it was time to see a lawyer. I couldn't keep living in limbo, not knowing what the future held. I needed to take control of the situation, to make a decision about my life moving forward. The idea of divorce felt like a final nail in the coffin, but I couldn't see any other way. Staying together after everything that had happened would just be living a lie, and I couldn't do that. The lawyer was understanding, professional, and laid everything out for me, what I could expect, what steps I needed to take, how the process would go. It all felt so cold, so clinical, but I knew it was necessary. By the time I left his office, I had a clear path ahead of me, even if it wasn't the one I had ever imagined taking. That night, I sent Emily a message, telling her that I was filing for divorce. I kept it short, factual, but I knew it would crush her. A part of me hated that I was hurting her, even after everything she had done, but I couldn't see another way forward. I needed to close this chapter of my life, to put it behind me, and start fresh. She didn't respond right away. And when she did, it was a simple, okay. No long messages, no begging me to reconsider. Just okay. I wondered if she had finally realized the gravity of what she had done, if she understood that there was no going back. In the days that followed, I started to feel a strange sense of relief. It wasn't that the pain was gone, far from it, but I felt like I was finally moving forward, finally taking control of my life again. I wasn't just reacting to Emily's betrayal, I was making decisions for myself, for my future. I started looking for a new place to live, something small and simple, just for me. It felt good to think about the future, to imagine a life without the constant weight of suspicion and betrayal. I didn't know what that life would look like yet, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like it might actually be possible. As for Emily, she seemed to accept the divorce without much resistance. We talked about the practicalities, splitting assets, selling the house, all the things that needed to be done. It was painful, but it was also freeing in a way. We were dismantling the life we had built together, piece by piece, and while it hurt, it also felt like the right thing to do. I started to reconnect with old friends, people I hadn't seen in years because I had been so wrapped up in my marriage. It felt good to be around people who didn't know about the mess my life had become, who just saw me as Mike, their old friend. I wasn't ready to dive into the dating world yet, but I started to see glimpses of what life could be like on the other side of all this. The divorce was finalized quicker than I expected, and just like that, it was over. The papers were signed, the house was sold, and Emily and I went our separate ways. It felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else, but it was also a relief. The chapter was closed, and I could finally start to heal. In the end, what hurt the most wasn't losing Emily, it was losing the life I thought we had, the future I had imagined. But as painful as it was, I knew I had made the right decision. I couldn't keep living in a lie, couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. I had to face the truth, no matter how ugly it was, and make a new path for myself, now. As I sit in my new apartment, the silence feels different. It's no longer suffocating, it's peaceful. It's the kind of silence that comes after a storm, when the skies are clear, and you can finally see the sun again. I know I'm not fully healed yet, but I'm on my way. And that, more than anything, gives me hope for the future. The day the divorce was finalized, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a sense of finality that I hadn't quite expected. It was over. The life I had known, the marriage I had fought so hard to save, was officially behind me. The papers were signed, the house was sold, and Emily was no longer a part of my life. I was free, but that freedom came with a heavy price. For a while, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. The first few days after the divorce were a blur. I spent a lot of time alone, trying to process everything that had happened. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet, but it was mine. I had chosen this place because it was nothing like the home I had shared with Emily, no memories to haunt me. No reminders of the life we once had. It was a blank slate, a place where I could start fresh. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects, pushing myself harder than ever before. It was a good distraction, something to keep my mind occupied. But even as I worked, I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me. The betrayal, the lies, the shattered trust, it was all still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be dealt with. I knew I couldn't run from it forever. So, one night, I sat down with a bottle of whiskey and started writing. I wrote about everything, how I felt, what I had been through, the anger, the pain, the sadness. I didn't hold anything back. It was raw, unfiltered, and brutally honest. And when I was done, I felt lighter, like I had finally started to let go of some of the weight I'd been carrying. As the weeks went by, I started to rebuild my life piece by piece. I reconnected with old friends, went out more, and even took up some new hobbies, things I had always wanted to try but never had the time or energy for. It was slow going, but with each passing day, I could feel myself starting to heal. I also started therapy. At first, I was hesitant, unsure if it would help, but it turned out to be one of the best decisions I made. Talking to someone who didn't know me, who didn't have any preconceived notions about my life, helped me sort through the mess of emotions I was dealing with. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I needed to understand what had happened, not just with Emily, but with myself. Why I hadn't seen the signs, why I had let things go on for so long, why I had been so willing to ignore the truth. Through therapy, I began to see things more clearly. I realized that Emily's betrayal, while devastating, wasn't just about her. It was about me too, about how I had lost myself in the marriage, how I had ignored my own needs and desires for the sake of keeping the peace, for the sake of love. I learned that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild, and that sometimes, the best thing you can do is walk away, and so, I walked away, from the pain, from the anger, from the life that no longer served me. I wasn't running from it anymore, I was letting it go. Piece by piece, I dismantled the walls I had built around myself and started to open up to the possibilities of a new life. One day, as I was going through some old boxes, I found a photo of Emily and me from our honeymoon. We were on a beach, the sun setting behind us, both of us smiling like we didn't have a care in the world. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, a longing for what could have been. But then I realized that the people in that photo didn't exist anymore. We had both changed, both grown, and as much as it hurt, I knew that our time together was over. I didn't throw the photo away, but I didn't keep it either. I put it back in the box, closed the lid, and shoved it to the back of my closet. It was a part of my past, but it didn't define my future. As I continued to rebuild, I started to notice a shift in myself. The anger that had once consumed me was fading, replaced by something softer, acceptance. I was beginning to accept what had happened, to understand that it was a part of my story, but not the whole story. I was learning to forgive, not just Emily, but myself. For the mistakes I had made, for the things I had ignored, for the ways I had let myself down, and with that forgiveness came something unexpected, hope. Hope that I could start over. That I could find happiness again, that I could rebuild my life on my own terms. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but I was ready to try. I started dating again, cautiously at first, but with an open mind. I met new people, went on a few dates, and even started to enjoy myself. It wasn't about finding someone to replace Emily, it was about finding myself again, about rediscovering what I wanted, what made me happy. And in the process, I found that I wasn't as broken as I thought. I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for, more resilient than I had imagined. The betrayal that had once defined me was now just a part of my past, not my future. Looking back, I realized that the experience had changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I was more cautious now, more aware of the red flags, more in tune with my own needs and boundaries. But I was also more open, more willing to take risks, more willing to let people in. I wasn't afraid of getting hurt anymore because I knew I could survive it. I had survived the worst, and I had come out the other side, as I sit here now, reflecting on everything that has happened. I can't help but feel grateful, for the lessons I've learned, for the strength I've found, for the new life I'm building. The past will always be a part of me, but it doesn't define me. I'm not the man who was betrayed, I'm the man who chose to rise above it, who chose to rebuild, who chose to live. And for anyone reading this who might be going through something similar, my advice is simple: don't let someone else's betrayal destroy you. You are stronger than you think, more resilient than you know. Take the time to heal, to understand what happened, and then let it go. The future is waiting for you, and it's brighter than you can imagine.
Bye-bye.